100 years of Rosa Luxemburg and reflecting on her politics, her conception of democracy and imperialism. Just to give a little bit of background to two things. The Democratic Marxism public lecture and theory seminar series has been running now since 2016. It's an attempt to provide a platform to critically reflect on historical Marxism as a body of unfinished work. It's an attempt to engage with the theories, categories, concepts, and so on of Marxism, but in relation to where we are. How do we use this to understand the world we are in? How do we use it to understand struggles, etc.? The other point to make is that the Democratic Marxism series is also a book project, and I don't know if I have it with me, but it's a series that's now in its fourth volume. The fourth volume that has just come out is called Racisms After Apartheid, Challenges for Marxism and Anti-Racism. And basically in this project we've attempted a dialogue between the international left and the South African left, asking crucial questions about particular thematic areas and so on. Now, today's panel discussion is really about reflecting on one of the great Marxists of the early 20th century, Rosa Luxemburg. She was murdered on January 15, 1990, in the context in which she and a group of the left of the Social Democratic Party broke away, arguing that the Social Democratic Party of that time had betrayed the workers of Germany by supporting an imperial war, First World War if you like, and wanting at the same time to create the conditions for a revolution in Germany. Rosa Luxemburg was murdered together with Karl Liebknecht. Their bodies were dumped in the river, and this was done by a social democrat in power, Friedrich Ebert Stifton, who unleashed the Freikorps, which was like a paramilitary organization. Now, Rosa Luxemburg is a very complex figure in Marxism. Some claim her as a revolutionary socialist. Some claim her as a radical Democrat, and maybe that's the direction I lean in, and so on and so on. But what is interesting about her is that in being committed to a fundamental transformation of capitalism, two things stand out in her work and the positions she took. One, she firmly believed in the self-organization of the working class, and through struggle, the working class will invent democracy, will invent the institutions of transformation. So she had a profound commitment and faith, if you like, in the organic capacities of the working class. The other important thing about her and her politics was also a critique of Leninism. And while being deeply sympathetic to the complexities that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were facing, she was not starry-eyed. And she was willing to unpack the dangers of the choices that were being made by the Bolsheviks. Closing down democratic space, shutting down the Constituent Assembly, banning parties, etc., etc. And she's very, very clear that democracy is the oxygen of struggle. And my favorite quote from her is, "Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently." Okay. And the Stalinist tradition has ensured that that kind of plurality is negated. So in this sense, Rosa Luxemburg for me is not, if you like, a typical revolutionary socialist. She is, in a profound sense, a Marxist with a deep commitment to a socialist democracy that deepens freedom, that widens democracy, that gives us more rights rather than less. But to help us understand her legacy today, including her work on imperialism, the inside-outside model, we have two great South African Marxists. I'm placing you in that camp, Patrick.
I'm not a social democrat.
We have Gunnett Kaaf, and Gunnett has been an activist for over 3 decades. He's been active in our national liberation politics at various levels as a youth leader. He's been active in the Communist Party. I'm not sure if he's still in the Communist Party, but he'll say more about all of that. And he's really one of our probing, dynamic, engaged young African intellectuals on the left. And so we're really, really excited to have him here today to help us grapple with this formidable legacy. We also have with us Patrick Bond, Professor Bond, who I think doesn't need much introduction. But Patrick has written extensively on various issues, ranging from climate justice to Africa's political economy and neo-colonialism, to understanding imperialism and sub-imperialism today, and so on and so on. And he's really given if you like, who brings forth a novel reading of Rosa Luxemburg, alongside people like David Harvey, Samir Amin, and so on. And so we're really pleased and excited. We've shared Patrick's article, the most recent one, which is out in the Australian Journal. Austrian Journal. Sorry about that. Austrian Journal of Sociology, Political Development, which is really about grappling with Rosa Luxemburg's conception of the inside-outside model of imperialism. So we've got these great comrades, intellectuals, and thinkers to help us grapple with these issues. You want to go first, right? Okay, over to you. Do you want to use this? Yes.
Thank you for that introduction, Vish. I hope my voice carries me. I woke up with flu this morning. Now, I wanted to send you an apology to say I have flu. Now, flu is like the NC, it's not credible. And yet it's so widespread. So people who have flu, they are hardly believable. Same as the NC, even those who are credible, they end up losing that credibility. The topic as framed by the organizers, Vish, is actually apt. It's about imperialism, democracy, and lessons for the South African left. It is now 100 years since Rosa Luxemburg, together with Karl Lechberg, was murdered by the German mercenaries. Rosa Luxemburg was certainly no less than a giant, both as a revolutionary and as an intellectual. As Mary Alice Walters points out, Rosa Luxemburg was born in 1871. Others say she was born 1870. I opt for 1871. A few days before the Paris Commune was proclaimed by the French workers, she died a little more than a year later after the Bolsheviks came to power in the Great October Revolution. Her life thus spent a great historical epoch, the 5 decades, which opened with the first dress rehearsal for socialist revolution in France and closed as a new era in the history of mankind was being born in Russia. Throughout her life, from her political awakening as a schoolgirl in Warsaw, Poland, until her death in Berlin, Germany, 1919, Rosa Luxemburg dedicated her immense energies, talents, capabilities, intellectual powers to the goal of the world socialist revolution. Rosa understood that the stakes were high, that the fate of humanity was at stake, and as a woman of action, she gave herself completely to the great historic battle of emancipation of humanity. Rosa was certainly a product of her times, but because she was such a great revolutionary and such a great intellectual, she was not only consumed by the immediate demands of her time, she looked way into the future. She acted actually into the future. That's why she remains relevant as she was 100 years ago today. So like I said, the topic as it has been framed is actually apt because some of the greatest contributions Rosa Luxemburg, are on imperialism and democracy. And how ironic that world capitalism is unstable today as it was 100 years ago when she died. You know, capitalism is undergoing a deep crisis like it was 100 years ago when she died. There was fascism was in its embryonic stages. You know, it developed to be more mature after she had died. Even today, we see the return of fascism in many ways, and the right-wing parties all over the world, in the global north and in the global south. That's why, I mean, you have a Trump in the US, a buffoon, right-wing. You have Macron in France, another right-wing. You have Bolsonaro in Brazil. So it's like history is repeating itself. But then history never repeats itself in returning cycles. It marches on all the time. So what we should attempt to do today is to understand what are the similarities and the continuities. For instance, about democracy, 100 years ago, the workers' movements had been defeated for some time. Some of the social democratic parties, as revolutionary Marxism called itself in the 19th century, for some time they had thought that a revolutionary rupture would come out of the universal franchise that had been won in a number of big European countries, France, Germany, and so on. But that had not materialized. So the war was on the advent. Different sections of the workers' movement were divided whether to enter war or not. Rosa Luxemburg was amongst those who were saying this is an imperialist war. It should not be supported by Marxists and socialists. Again, the Russian Revolution had just happened. You know, it was not supported by workers from the West. You know, for a number of reasons. The workers' movement in the West had lost revolutionary initiative. The workers' movement in the West was trapped in the bourgeois economism of the Second International, that bourgeois revolutions that socialist revolutions were to triumph first in the main centers of capitalism. That in the peripheries, what you needed was bourgeois revolution, so that economic forces developed to a higher stage. Lenin proved them wrong to say actually Russia is the weakest link in the chain of imperialism, and he read the mood. The socialist revolution in Russia was not made by the Bolshevik necessarily, but rather it was a popular revolution. But the Bolshevik, in the Bolshevik, there was a time when they were divided. You know, there was a time when Trotsky was not on the side of Lenin. But then Lenin, when he returned from exile, Switzerland, is it Switzerland or Sweden? Switzerland. Switzerland, yes. When he returned he read the mood that there's already a dual power. You know, the power in the Soviets, which were like people's organs, and the power of the provisional government that had taken over since February. But the provisional government would never amount to anything revolutionary. You know, so the power of the Soviets, together with the workers, the soldiers, had to be crystallized in a revolution. Lenin read that, and he helped inspire the move towards a revolution in October. So workers' movement in the West didn't understand that. Rosa Luxemburg was with Lenin. And in fact, she was highly disappointed that the workers in the West did not understand that. Now, we don't have enough time. I'm going to try to deal with the three topics. First, imperialism. Secondly, democracy, briefly, and then go to challenges for the South African left. On imperialism, already Rosa Luxemburg's imperialist theory, I stand the risk of being accused of being reductionist with the formulation that I'm going to make. Rosa Luxemburg's imperialist theory was mainly founded on her accumulation capital theory. And her accumulation capital theory, on the other hand, was rather based on her crisis theory of capitalism. She had been conducting lectures at the party school, and she wanted to write a textbook. Before that, she thought that Karl Marx had done everything in Das Kapital in terms of researching and analyzing capitalism as an economic development, as an economic system on which class struggle has to be waged. All that needed to be done was to promote it and add details as history was moving on. But as she was writing that textbook, she realized that actually the scheme that Karl Marx outlines about capital accumulation is inadequate, because she realized that capitalism, by its very nature, creates less consumption for the production it takes out. So it produces more than it can consume. Why? Because workers earn lesser than what they produce. So even when she tried to go and look at the scheme of the two departments of the productive means of production department, as well as the consumption of goods department, and how they exchange, she could not see how capitalism or capital accumulation would happen. You know, she thought that there would be, because of the limited consumption, as opposed to what Karl Marx had said, that capitalism has a tendency of declining rates and therefore sliding into crisis. Her reading was that it's inherently like that from the outset. Rates don't decline in the long term. In the immediate, there's no consumption. So there has to be another explanation about how the shortfall in the accumulation is to be made. And for that, she saw world markets, which is where her imperialism theory comes in. And that in the world markets, countries of the center tend to go to countries that are backward, that are in pre- or non-capitalist stages. They conquer them, they dominate them, and they use the military spending as well. Her imperialism tenets was ready to cover up for the accumulation crisis, but also to dominate world markets, and that led to wars and revolutions. So her theory of underconsumption or lack of effective demand has been taken up by others, including Mikhail Kalecki, who actually formulated the Keynesian theory even before Keynes. Keynes himself, even though he was a bourgeois economist, he was quite a sharp thinker to see that capitalism is actually unstable because it does not have the sufficient demand for the goods it produces. Other great economists who took it up were Paul Baran, Paul Swayze, and Joseph Stangieli. Again, something important about her thought on imperialism. I've already spoken about Russia, her views on Russia, which were a minority in the West. something worth saying about imperialism theory is that when the 1899 Anglo-Boer War broke out in South Africa, most European socialists backed the Britain using the bourgeois economism theory that I had spoken about, to say when Britain takes over South Africa, that's going to have a civilizing effect. It's going to help develop South Africa into a mature capitalism. A few of them were backing the Boers. But Rosa Luxemburg was amongst the few who condemned the Anglo-Boer War as an imperialist war that was going to lead to the oppression of the majority of South Africans. Another important thing about Rosa Luxemburg and imperialism is that Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and Bukharin were like the few socialists at the time who predicted the Second World War, based on their imperialist theory. So that's why even in today's, as we grapple with imperialism, she remains quite relevant. But again, because she thought that the countries in the center were conquering countries of global south and subordinating them to their development. So she saw imperialism as a polarizing world organization. She did not see it as something that the people of the South deserved. So in the imperialist struggles, she sided with the people of the global South. Now, I want to get to democracy. Vish had already started talking about her views on democracy, that she contested the universalist dimension of democracy. To say the fact that workers have been defeated in democratic struggles at the turn of the century does not mean that democracy is essentially bourgeois. No. If anything, democracy is a liberating concept that the workers must fight for in ongoing struggles, as they say, to democratize their societies further and further. My favorite quote on Rosa Luxemburg reads as thus: "The international movement of the proletariat towards its complete emancipation is a process peculiar in the following respect. For the first time in the history of civilization, the people are expressing their will consciously and in opposition to all ruling classes. But this will can only be satisfied beyond the limits of the existing society. Now, the mass can only acquire and strengthen this will in the course of day-to-day struggle against existing social order, that is, within the limits of capitalist society. On the one hand, we have the mass. On the other, its historic goal located outside existing society. On one hand, we have day-to-day struggle, and on the other, we have social revolution. Such are the terms of the dialectic contradiction through which socialist movement makes its way through." Close quote. As Vish had said, she opposed the Leninist vanguardism. Way then, she saw it already that it was going to lead to Stalinism. And in many respects, history has vindicated Rosa. But Rosa did not only provide a critique to the left, she also provided, she was also known to be one of the defenders of the revolutionary content of social democracy, as Marxist socialism called itself in the 19th century. So she locked horns with senior comrades in the European social democracy, who were like revisionists, reformists, who thought that capitalism could just be reformed. Eduardo Bestem is one of them. Her work on reform and revolution, where she was exposing opportunism and reformism of some of the leading cadres. Let me also read this quote, Vish, on Vendadism. She says, okay, no, I'll be done before 5 minutes. She says, the working class demands the right to make mistakes and in the dialectic of history. Let us speak plainly. Historically, the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are more fruitful than the infallibility of the cleverest central committee. So now, I come to the last point and I'll be brief. Already we can see some of the lessons that how we go about in rebuilding the South African left. We have to look at mass movements, the autonomy of mass movements, and how these mass movements must be organized to articulate the immediate and long-term social demands of popular classes. And as they do so, they must fight for a world that is not capitalist. They must also fight against neoliberalism. I should have said that when we talk about renewing the South African left, the scene for that is a crisis that our country is going through. A crisis that is getting deep every day. A political crisis of poor governance, an economic crisis, stagnation, high unemployment, widespread poverty, worsening township and rural underdevelopment, and environmental destruction. So much that there are only two big outcomes that can come out of this crisis. It's either going to get worse, where there will be a decay or a decadence, or a radical social transformation. And so there's no middle road, because for as long as the crisis continues, it's going to get worse. Even with Cyril at the helm, it does not get better. It gets worse. You can see the McBride saga. I mean, if Cyril was really there for cleanup, he would have intervened by now. But McBride is left there to fight against the criminal factions of the ANC. So the crisis we have is driven by two main factors. One is lack of transformation, meaningful social transformation since 1994. The second one is the obscene corruption that is getting worse. And like I said, even under Cyril, since Nazareth, it's not been halted and reversed, which is what can stop it. Instead, Cyril is just better, but he does not have the minimum requirements to halt it and reverse it. He's constrained, he won with a slight margin. So he has to negotiate everything. So in the process of negotiation, he makes deal with the devil. So like I said, the way forward for the left in the current impasse that is threatening to be worse is not to form a workers' party that is centralized or a vanguard that will contest the coming elections with a socialistic manifesto and hope to get a few parliamentary seats that they will use. Actually, any preoccupation with some centralized party of the left wing will be a serious distraction. Instead, the left must work with popular classes to build strong grassroots and sector mass movements that must fight for the immediate social demands of the popular classes in areas such as education, food, women, health, youth, sports, and so on. I had already said that these struggles must have an anti-capitalist outlook and an anti-neoliberal outlook. This is not to lose sight of the imperative of political power, but is to admit that without real mass work, there's little that we can be able to do to impact upon the electoral system that has become an impasse in terms of the choices it offers to the voters. But when we organize popular power from below, as the left, we'll be able to exert pressure on the electoral system, and then on the base of that popular power, we'll be able to launch political alternatives, you know, even a mass left political party or political parties who said should be one. Then the issue of popular struggles I've spoken about. I'm taking your time, which thank you.
Just wrap up. If you want to say one last word.
The last word is this one. It's a quote again from Rosa Luxemburg. Because this crisis, it sort of depicts the contrast that she spoke about of it's either barbarism or socialism. That's where we are. Now, we can't opt for barbarism. So, just a few weeks before she died, speaking to her comrades, she says, "Today we can seriously set about destroying capitalism once and for all. Nay more, not merely are we today in a position to perform this task, not merely is its performance a duty towards the proletariat, but our solution offers the only means of saving human society from destruction." Amandla.
Thank you.
Amanda! Okay, I can do that too. But are the comrades in the room organic intellectuals, worker leaders? Is that right? How many of you are coming from
Trade union.
Yeah, how many?
Lots of them.
Many. That's wonderful. Then I will bore you with what we do in universities, dear comrades. Unorganic intellectual work. Are we getting this? Okay, good. And if you don't mind, I'll do exactly what Gunnett did, but just a bit more detail on some things, and I'll avoid your electoral debates. I think if we simply work on what kind of ideology has Rosa Luxemburg left us, what ideas that then lead to strategies and tactics and alliances that we'll have to explore together. I think they come from the critique of capitalist crisis that we heard from Gunnett, and that is overproduction. He says under consumption, maybe a tiny difference in our emphasis, but particularly, as Vish put it, inside capitalism is the law of motion, but outside are lots of other things, the non-capitalist relations that she talks about. Let's explore that, because there are circuits of capital that we, in the Marxian political economy tradition, we mainly look at those. But we've been realizing, and we have to, in this country, in this continent, put social reproduction and political ecology right into the heart of that analysis. The way she did. Rosa looked at imperialism, and I think were she here today, she would recognize something I will call sub-imperialism, a new layer that's emerged for reasons we'll examine quickly. And part of what we're looking at in the continent is amplified looting through the resource depletion, which is, in those two last points, the whole effort in my boring academic paper about Luxemburg reapplied in Africa. I hope you, if comrades want that paper, want more discussion, I'll just introduce it very briefly. And that, I think, gives us a sense of what sort of necessity in anti-capitalist and feminist and ecological and anti-racist resistance. Don't forget, we are lacking ideology. Don't take it from an expat. It's the greatest danger that threatens Africa, said Frantz Fanon, particularly, as Cabral emphasized, the total lack of ideology against imperialism. Here I do not mean, as I've been reading from Gayton Mackenzie, authoritative source on Jacob Zuma's anti-imperialism, a very impressive book called, I learned actually quite a lot, I think some of it's true even, and it's called Kill Zuma by Any Means Necessary. But you really do get, don't you, that Zuma anti-imperialism replaced by a sort of more Western-oriented politics. So BRICS makes it quite interesting. It's an amazing moment as Jair Bolsonaro takes over BRICS, a fascist running this allegedly anti-imperialist bloc. In other words, it's so shallow, that anti-imperialism, that Zuma can spout about BRICS anti-imperialism. I'll come to that so you have a sense. We tried to do this about a dozen years ago in a meeting. We have a book that came from it that the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung produced. So that's online, it's available, I'll happily send it. Since then, there's been some, I think, more sophisticated approaches, because that was the first era of rediscovery of Luxemburg, particularly the rediscovery of the accumulation of capital, 1913, and just as Gunnett said, it's the core argument of over-accumulation, crisis tendencies, and capital can't accumulate without the aid of non-capitalist relations. That's the continual extension of the market. If you're polite, you use the word globalization, but we're not, so we'll say it's imperialism, and the continuous and progressive disintegration of the non-capitalist relations is why Luxemburg's understanding of imperialism, north versus south, if you will, global north, global south, is different than, say, Lenin, Bukharin, Hilferding, who were looking more at the inter-imperial rivalries of core capitalist accumulation states and hinterlands. She really put the non-capitalist relations and how capital can proceed, but at the cost of this medium, nevertheless, by eating it up. You see, the capital takes the non-capitalists. What do we mean by the non-capitalists? She spent a bit of time reading. She never visited, but she read what she could about South Africa, Namibia, DRC, and chapter 27 of this book has some extremely insightful understandings of things like the old colonial strategies, the hut taxes to get black workers into the mines and the fields and the factories, or the ways in which mutual aid systems that women had built up were destroyed. And she talked, I'll show you in a minute, a little bit about nature. So she found in our neck of the woods some case studies that we should now, I think, revisit and say, well, we didn't do very well if we're still the most unequal country. We do have others in this region, three that passed away in the last year that I'll just mention. Samir Amin, who worked on a labor theory that was unequal exchange through north-south power, and capital and the non-capitalist was part of that. And he had a complicated relationship with Luxemburg's work that I describe in the article. Saint-Pierre Blanche died just about a year ago. He was in his Lost in Transformation and his History of Inequality in South Africa, the two major books about South Africa. Very clear on the racial character of the capitalist-non-capitalist relation. And Anne-Marie Wolpe died last year, and she did a strong analysis of feminist aspects, especially of the Bantustan relationships in social reproduction, where women are, giving up the child-raising time and efforts, the looking after sick workers who come back from their jobs injured, ill, and then looking after workers who were retired, who were given little more than a watch or a bicycle, perhaps. And that extra effort that women make without state support in apparatuses or medical aids or creches or pensions, that is a super exploitative process in the capitalist-non-capitalist relationship. And Harold Wolpe put it as articulation of modes of production, capital meeting the non-capitalists to explain that durability of apartheid. I think Dani Nabuderi picked up more of her work in the theories of overproduction leading to financialization. So he did some of the best work, although he passed about 8 years ago, in crisis tendencies that move into the banking sector. And my own influences from two mentors, Neil Smith and David Harvey, tried to pull this together as a general theory of uneven and combined development. They do draw so much on the perpetual overproduction within Luxemburg's analysis of capitalism. This is what's inside, the ceaseless flow of capital from one branch to the other, the periodical and cyclical swings of reproduction between overproduction and crisis. You can map it out, we don't have time to do this, but it certainly is true to classical Marxist understandings in the labor theory of value of where crisis tendencies emerge. And when they emerge there, they move into different sectors, different spaces, without time to go into all the different manifestations that we can read contemporary crises from that early theory. I'd say that one of the advances, not just from Harvey, whose chart I'm looking at, but Nancy Fraser in trying to foreground production, labor theory of value, but also put social reproduction, ecological impacts, and then the interesting area of the state-society relations. These are some of our Luxemburgists, in my view, and they'll say so themselves. For Harvey, it was in 2003 to bring back theories of imperialism based on overproduction, overaccumulation. More recent works deepen these, particularly to say it's not now inside, outside vicious, it's actually the free gifts of nature, the free gifts of women in patriarchal societies are actually core to the accumulation process. They're not sort of add-ons, but you can do more to theorize in terms of gender, political ecology. Oh, he hasn't gone into the race politics, which are very difficult to theorize in relation to capital. Ben Margabani did a very sterling historical effort, but I think if we take a bigger view of capital that's come out of this relatively newer Luxemburgist work, of Harvey especially, you'll find that we have tendencies to overproduce, then we have ruinous competition, right? That's a classic way in which the system, which seems to work for one or two capitalists who get ahead, is now being undermined by them all, by this ruinous competition, because capital is then responding by, with labor, with, as Marx put it, relative and absolute surplus value, trying to make the system more efficient by replacing workers with machines or speeding up the process. So whether you call that the overproduction or the underconsumption, it then turns to capitalist, non-capitalist, as Luxemburg shows us, and imperialism. And then there's a variety of these spatio-temporal reactions, including the newer theory of stealing, of capital stealing from the non-capitalists. This is, I think, some of the better ways to work through our contemporary capitalist crisis. Overproduction is amplified, imperialism comes from this process, and then we have capitals trying to resist that devalorization. We're seeing that right now with Trump and US and China, lots of ways in which a new geopolitical terrain is being forged out of the struggle against who takes the hit on devaluation from the limits to capital. So how does it look recently? A crisis that particularly in 2008 blew up and allowed 5 countries to emerge. First they were absorbers, and then they were producers of surplus capital. Then they became competitors, right? These are the sub-imperial powers. 5 I want to mention in particular. Each developing center of accumulation sought out its own fixes, its own geographical and financialized ways of dealing with it. And basically, that means you shift the problem around, you stall it over time using finance, and you steal. You can shift and stall and steal these techniques of capitalist crisis management in a way Luxemburg would absolutely recognize. You can find some of this at the davidharvey.org. Be clear, this is not a resolution of capitalist crisis tendencies, it's a displacement. In fact, as you move it around, as you displace it over time with credit, you actually make it worse. You shift, you stall, you steal, but you don't resolve it. And that means capital needs other economic mediums as its soil, right? The movement of accumulation provides a solution to the conflict. It displaces it. Sorry, it sort of moves it around, but it aggravates it at the same time. You see this dialectic that's in play here. We've seen this very clearly, haven't we, in the 80s and 90s, in the period since 2008. We overproduced. We had massive fixed capital investment in the 60 to 82 period, and then that period of overaccumulation crisis and the need to end apartheid to get capital out. And then we had the next period after 2000 in a similar way with a big boom because mainly a commodity supercycle and consumer credit boosted fixed capital investment. This is overaccumulation followed by the subsequent period, the last decade, of stagnation. There's a Wits economist whom I work with, Chris Malakani. We've taken from Nicholas Natras the concern about falling rates of profit being one of those key indicators of the crisis tendencies of overaccumulation, precisely. And then corporates respond with liberalizing, with globalizing, they find some allies. I want to use some reputable sources here, like this one, who says actually capital pushed the ANC into doing a series of deals, right? Of course we got one person, one vote in a unitary state, but look at all the deals that had to be done to satisfy capital, to allow them to liberalize and globalize. If we have time, we can explore all these as logical aspects of the displacement. But these are areas where we basically found ourselves a neo-colonial satellite of the US-led neoliberal empire, according to Blanche. Chris Malakani shows it as a falling rate of profit, a restoration through the Faustian Pax in the 90s, 2000s, until the big crash, and now a decline in the rate of profit as we suffer overaccumulation. It's exactly the same story at global scale as well, of course. So that means more stealing, and we really have a big problem, don't we? We think it's our corrupt state officials, the one that study in my university, Wits School of Governance. In fact, it's a Wits business school that turns out the very best in the world, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers. The world leader in money laundering, bribery, corruption, procurement fraud, asset misappropriation, cybercrime. You can tell them, as you see in the screen, by the color of their skins. They're basically in Santon and Stellenbosch. Every 2 years when PwC measures corporate corruption, our lads come in number one. They get the gold medal. But they take their money out as fast as they can. $21 billion, around 300 billion rand a year in illicit financial flows. One of the great exponents and practitioners of this is none other than Cyril Ramaphosa, as chair of MTN, as the second major investment in Longman, in Shanduka as well. In comparison, our bureaucrats and politicians are not doing much stealing. They only rank number 73rd in the world out of 180 Transparency International shows. If you hear about corruption, salute the leaders who are the corporates who do this accumulation by dispossession. They're basically like what you see here, which are the scramblers in Berlin from 5 countries who came in and basically looted by setting up governments that set up the contracts and the infrastructure to take it all out. So this is what Luxemburg saw in Africa's carving in 1884-85. These were Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, now joined, I think, by 5 others. I think this is what this next layer of BRICS penetration of Africa is going to be like. The rhetoric will always be against neocolonialism and neoliberalism, maybe not from Brasilia anymore, but actually it's about getting a seat at the table, isn't it? And that would be in areas like finance. We can go through the details of what a sub-imperial location looks like when you strengthen the IMF and World Bank at the expense of African and Latin American countries, or when you sit at a table like this. This is where Africa, it's not nice to be a raw piece of meat. This is where it gets cooked. It's called Copenhagen. And this is where 5 leaders, Obama and 4 of the BRICS, agreed to basically wreck the UN and pop a massive increase in African climate change. You just see how unevenly this continent is burning. So how did Luxemburg see this? She basically saw a battle of annihilation against every historical form of natural economy, and that's the societies, the indigenous African societies. But, as I argue in some detail, also depletion of non-renewable resources is quite central to this. That means capital is always looking to grab and pull out raw materials ultra cheap. The name for this, by the way, this looting, is Africa Rising. Right, and it starts to come up because of this commodity super cycle. Yes, there was some African increase in GDP, but if you look at what is left out of GDP, the depletion of the resources in the ground, and women's work as well, unpaid social reproduction and community work, just left out of GDP. So yes, Africa had a higher GDP, but what it was actually losing was natural, they call it capital, but our resource base, natural capital. Even Herman Daly used a sort of Luxemburg framing to say, stop counting this as income. We have to understand this as a form of exploitation. And as a result, we should be anti-imperial, anti-globalization. He goes through some very interesting arguments, though he quit in disgust as the main environmental economist at the World Bank. He did leave enough there that the World Bank, the full page isn't out here, but it's doing a study called The Changing Wealth of Nations, which does let us measure this. And in Gaborone, about 7 years ago, African leaders actually committed to measuring this process of natural economy in decline as capital moves in. And even the late Edna Malewa, the environment minister here, signed on to this. And what it really means, just to go through it, is that when you correct your GDP, if there are economists in the room, my own personal recovery from being an economist was to also acknowledge the gender and now this change you need to do if you want to do your accounting properly. That means your natural resources that go into the platinum and the coal and the iron ore, the gold, the main exports we put out here, those need to be subtracted from not just a positive credit in GDP, but the depletion of those resources. When you do that, 88% of Africa is depleting wealth in net terms. So most of the rest of the world is booming because of this, but you can see Africa is absolutely crashing at the point where it's about 100 billion a year. If you hear the two words Africa rising, which you don't very much anymore, but it's part of this wonderful myth that if you just export raw materials and China buys them, everything will be all right. It's actually a 3 to 6% decline in your GDP every year. For us, it means a loss of about 245 or 3,000 rand per year per person, because we're not counting properly the amount of resources that go into the exports. And of course, the exports are taken away by multinationals. It's in this sense to conclude that we really have to have a broader political ecological, a broader feminist, broader anti-racist, and anti-imperialist conception of this destruction of the non-capitalist strata at home and in the outside world because of this string of political disasters and compulsions. And she actually spends quite a bit of time at the end of accumulation of capital looking at case studies of revolts. So I was thinking what the necessity, the social power of the Arab family associations and stubborn resistance against the French yoke. She goes through the Native Americans, First Nations fights, the 9 bloody wars in South Africa. But if we look at all the ways in which these resistance processes pop out, I think the aim of socialism becomes clear. Not accumulation, but the satisfaction of toiling humanity's wants. So, 5 last slides if you allow. One is the destruction of apartheid in its, let's call it the scaffolding of legal, constitutional, and various other forms of racial power that led to one person, one vote in a unitary state against so many odds, against capital, imperialism, local whites. None of them wanted this, right? And it took until the early 90s for the likes of Anglo-American to finally concede that was important to win. Secondly, I think another of the 5 people's power examples would be these community struggles to get decommodified water, sanitation, electricity, to fight for the rights of communities, and they won. They had a healthy, debate with the state, and they won at least the first part of this when Ronnie Kasrils was the water minister, free basic water, a little free electricity. Now, of course, every struggle in the communities reflects that wasn't enough, it was tokenistic, but it's one of those beginnings. The most important, obviously, to get free, decommodified, public-provided, generic medicines at a time when it was big pharma corps supplying branded medicines, and they cost 100,000 rand a year. Do you remember those bad days 15 or 18 years ago? And the struggle to get free AIDS medicines now has led to about 5 million people getting them from the public schools, and life expectancy went from 52 to 64 today as a result of that. The fourth would be perhaps the push to get rid of Zuma and Gupta, and to do so in all sorts of citizens' modes of trying to challenge, for example, the e-tolling that some of us probably came to today's meeting by violating, right? I think these are some of the interesting aspects. But of course, we have to say fees must fall, getting both insourcing of underpaid workers and at least this promise of getting the free tertiary education for undergraduates. These are some of the things that, if you put these together, come to some sort of ideology, I think, to answer Fanon and Cabral's complaints, an anti-imperialism, but one that's suffused with the sorts of values of the democratic Marxism series. Thank you very much.
So, the political legacy and tradition of Rosa Luxemburg lives. lives in a renewed Marxist global political economy analysis. It is living in debates on the left about democracy, political strategy, practice, etc. We're going to open this up. Comments, questions, engagements,
Corrections.
corrections. Okay, who wants to go?